The village of Ember sat nestled between rolling green hills and a dense forest that whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. It was a peaceful place where neighbors looked out for one another, where gossip spread as quickly as wildfire, and where traditions ruled over reason. At the heart of this village lived Malia, a widow and the most gifted cook Ember had ever known. Her food was legendary, filling the streets with rich, intoxicating aromas. It was said that one bite of Malia's stew could cure sadness, that her roasted meats could make men forget their sorrows, and that her sweetbread could make children dream of wonders beyond the village. But Malia did not cook for glory. She cooked for survival. Her husband, Rowan, had died years before, leaving her alone to care for their daughter, Zaya. Malia worked tirelessly, waking before the sun, preparing her meals with love, and selling them in the village square. The villagers adored her, not just for her food, but for her kindness. She always had an extra bowl for those who could not pay and a warm smile for those who had lost hope. And then came the feast that would change everything. The nobleman's arrival. It was a harvest celebration, a night of music, dance, and tables overflowing with food. The villagers laughed, their worries forgotten under the glow of lanterns and the scent of spiced meat in the air. Among them sat Darren, the young nobleman from the capital. He was a lord's son, visiting Ember on a hunting trip with his companions. He had heard of Malia's cooking and, with curiosity and arrogance, demanded to taste it for himself. Malia, ever gracious, served him a steaming bowl of stew. Darren ate greedily, praising her food between mouthfuls. "This," he declared, raising his cup, "is the best meal I have ever had." The villagers cheered, proud that their humble cook had impressed a nobleman. But hours later, everything changed. The tragedy, the laughter had long faded when a cry rang out through the village. People rushed to the nobleman's quarters, where Darren lay convulsing on the floor, his mouth foaming, his skin pale as death. His men tried to help, but there was nothing they could do. Within minutes, Darren vomited blood and died. Panic spread like wildfire. Had he been poisoned? The whispers began almost immediately. What did he eat? Someone asked. Malia's stew, another voice answered. The joyful night turned dark. A hush fell over the village square as the people turned to Malia. Her hands trembled as she shook her head. "I would never," she began. But no one listened. Fear turned to rage. Malia poisoned the nobleman. Someone shouted. "She killed him. She's a witch." The very people who had once praised her food now looked at her with hatred and suspicion. They surrounded her, their faces twisted with anger. Zaya, only 10 years old, clung to her mother's dress, her small voice lost in the shouting. Malia fell to her knees, pleading, "I swear on my life, I am innocent." But the villagers were too consumed by fear to listen. And so, the woman who had once fed them with kindness was dragged away, accused of murder and witchcraft. As her daughter screamed in terror, the night sky over Ember Village was black, void of stars, as if the heavens themselves refused to witness what was about to happen. The people who had once loved Malia now became her judges and executioners. They dragged her through the village square, the very place where her food had once brought them joy. She stumbled over the cobblestone path, her hands bound behind her, her clothes torn, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Zaya screamed for her mother, tears streaming down her face as she tried to push through the mob. But rough hands held her back. "Stay away, child," an old woman hissed. "Your mother is a murderer." Malia's voice rang out over the clamor. "Please, I am innocent. I would never harm anyone." But the village had already made its decision. A man stepped forward, Orlan, the town elder, his face carved with years of wisdom, now hardened with grim duty. "A nobleman is dead," he declared, his voice carrying over the enraged crowd. Malia was the one who fed him last. He turned to the people. "What is our law?" A voice answered, cold and resolute, "Poisoners must die." The villagers echoed it like a chant. Malia trembled, her eyes darting around for a single kind face. A friend, someone who would stand up for her. But there were none. Those who might have defended her kept their eyes on the ground, afraid of turning the mob's wrath upon themselves. Zaya fell to her knees, her hands clenched into tiny fists. "Please," she sobbed, "she's not a murderer, she's my mother." But no one listened. The execution. The village square became an execution ground. A pile of stones was gathered. The same hands that had once reached for Malia's food now reached for weapons. Malia was forced to kneel, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She locked eyes with Zarya, trying to fill her last moments with love, not fear. Be strong, she mouthed. The first stone struck her shoulder. She gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. The second hit her cheek, splitting the skin. A third, her ribs. More followed, raining down in a storm of hatred and hysteria, until Malia collapsed, her blood staining the earth. Zarya's wails pierced the night. But the crowd had already turned away. Their justice was done. By dawn, Malia, the kind-hearted cook of Ember Village, was dead. The orphan's fate. Zarya sat by her mother's lifeless body until the sun rose, her small hands clinging to the torn fabric of Malia's dress. She whispered her name over and over, as if saying it enough times would bring her back. But the village had no place for an orphan tied to a murderer's name. By midday, the elders decided her fate. She would be sent away, to the nearby town of Brimholt, where her mother's estranged brother, Uncle Tovan, lived, with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and her mother's old cooking spoon. Zarya was placed in the back of a wagon. She looked over her shoulder one last time as the village that had once been her home disappeared in the distance. Tears blurred her vision, but deep inside, something hardened in her heart. She would never forget, she would never forgive, and one day, she would return to Ember Village. The road to Brimholt was long and unforgiving. Zarya sat in the back of the wagon, silent, hollow, her hands clutched around the only thing she had left of her mother, her wooden cooking spoon. The villagers of Ember had stolen her childhood, her happiness, her family. Now, they had sent her away like a discarded memory. When the wagon finally came to a halt outside a small stone cottage, a man stepped out. His beard was streaked with gray, his face worn from years of labor. Uncle Tovan. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Come inside, child, he said at last. A new life in Brimholt. Brimholt was different from Ember. The people didn't whisper when she passed, didn't glance at her with suspicion. To them, she was just an orphan girl. Tovan and his wife, Mira, were kind enough. They gave her food, a bed, and let her help with household chores. Their children, Joran and Leela, treated her like a sister. But no matter how warm the house was, Zarya still felt cold inside. She missed her mother's voice, the way Malia would hum while she cooked, the way she would stroke Zarya's hair and call her little sunbeam. And at night, when the house was quiet, Zarya would close her eyes and see the village square. The stones, the blood, the betrayal. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind. Be strong. But Zarya wasn't sure how. The forgotten truth. Years passed. Zarya grew into a strong, clever young woman. She helped Mira in the kitchen, picking up her mother's old skills. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread was comforting. It reminded her of a time before the world had turned against her. On the night of her 18th birthday, after the others had gone to bed, Uncle Tovan called her outside. They sat by the fire, its golden light flickering against his warm face. There's something you must know, he said, his voice heavy. About your mother. Zarya stiffened. Tovan hesitated, then sighed. She was innocent. Her breath caught in her throat. What? The nobleman, Darren. He wasn't poisoned. Not by her. Zarya's hands trembled. Then, who did it? Tovan looked into the fire, his eyes dark. It wasn't poison at all. It was a curse. The witches of Hollow Forest. Zarya stared at him, heart-pounding. The nobleman, Tovan continued, was cursed by the witches of Hollow Forest. He was doomed to die the moment he left the capital. It had nothing to do with Malia. Zarya's stomach twisted. Then why did they kill her? Fear. Tovan's fists clenched. The witches let the villagers believe the lie, and fear did the rest. They wanted to punish your mother, because she refused them. Zarya's breath hitched. She knew the witches. Tovan nodded. They approached her once, long before you were born. They wanted her to join them. But Malia, she had no interest in their dark ways. Zarya's nails dug into her palms. Her mother had died not because she was guilty, but because she was too strong to be controlled. Because she had refused to bow to evil. Because someone needed to take the blame. Zaya's chest burned. For years, she had believed her mother's death was a cruel accident, a mistake of justice. Now she knew the truth. Her mother had been murdered. By lies, by fear, by the witches who had started it all. Zaya exhaled, slow and steady. She had spent years running from Ember. Now, she would return, but not to beg for forgiveness. Not to rebuild her mother's name. She would return to avenge her. The road back to Ember Village felt colder than Zaya remembered. The trees whispered with the wind, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The village lay ahead, untouched by time, as if her mother's death had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. But for Zaya, it had never ended. She had returned not as the frightened child they had cast away, but as a woman with a purpose. She would uncover the truth. She would find the witches of Hollow Forest. And she would make them pay. The empty stall. She set up her food stall in the marketplace, just as her mother once had. She woke before dawn, prepared the most fragrant stews, and waited. But the villagers only glanced at her warily as they passed. She looks just like Malia. Someone whispered. The murderer's daughter. The first day, no one came. The second, the same. By the third, Zaya could no longer ignore the fear in their eyes. They would never trust her food. Not after what happened to her mother. That night, as she walked home in defeat, a voice called from the darkness. Lost, child. Zaya froze. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and something rotten. A hunched figure stepped into the moonlight. A woman cloaked in shadows. Her face wrinkled like old parchment. A witch. Zaya clenched her fists. I know what you did to my mother. The witch smiled, slow and knowing. Ah, so you finally see the truth. Zaya's blood burned with rage. You cursed the nobleman. You framed her. The witch's milky eyes gleamed. We did. Zaya's heart pounded. Why? She refused us. The witch tilted her head. Amused. Just like you were about to. Zaya stiffened. Your mother was a gifted cook. The witch continued. But she refused our assistance. Her smile turned sharp, and look where that led her. Zaya said nothing. We offer you the same gift. The witch reached into her tattered robe and pulled out a small vial of black powder. Mix this into your food, she whispered, and they will crave it. They will forget their fears. They will worship you. Zaya's stomach turned. This is what your mother refused. The witch continued. But you don't have to make the same mistake. Zaya's breath was unsteady. The villagers would never trust her. Not unless she gave them a reason to. But her mother had said no. And it had cost her everything. Would Zaya do the same? She swallowed hard. And if I refuse? The witch's smile faded. Then you will lose. Just like she did. The cold wind howled as the witch stepped closer, pressing the vial into Zaya's hand. Choose wisely, child. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished into the night. Zaya looked down at the vial in her trembling hands. A part of her screamed to throw it away. But another voice whispered, what if this is the only way? Zaya sat in her small cottage, staring at the tiny vial of black powder in her hand. She turned it over, watching the way the dark grains clung to the glass. As if alive, the witch's words echoed in her mind. Mix this into your food. And they will crave it. They will forget their fears. They will worship you. Her mother had refused this power. And it had cost her life. But Zaya had suffered enough. She had been cast aside. Humiliated. Left to starve while the villagers whispered behind her back. Why should she suffer for their mistakes? Slowly, she uncorked the vial. The next morning, Zaya cooked as she always did. Only this time, she followed the witch's instructions. A pinch of the black powder, a single strand of her own hair, a piece of herself. As required, she stirred the pot, her hands steady, though her stomach twisted with unease. By midday, she set up her stall in the market once again. And this time, something was different. The villagers who had once avoided her now lingered. The scent of her food wrapped around them like a siren's call. One by one, they stepped forward, one bowl, then another, and another. Within an hour, her pots were empty. The people of Ember praised her food louder than they ever had her mother's. This is incredible. It tastes like nothing I've ever had before. I must have more tomorrow. Zaya watched in stunned silence as the very people who had once accused her mother now smiled at her, thanked her, adored her. That night, she counted more silver and gold than she had ever seen in her life. And yet, she felt nothing. Days turned to weeks. Zaya's stall became the most visited in Ember Village. People from neighboring towns traveled just to taste her food. Even the village elders, who once branded her a murderer's daughter, praised her name. She moved from her small cottage into a grand home in the center of the village. But deep inside, a shadow loomed over her heart. The food never spoiled. The customers never stopped coming. No matter how much she cooked, people always wanted more. She could feel the magic working. And every night, she dreamt of the witch's face. Then, one evening, as Zaya counted her earnings, a cold wind crept into her home. The fire flickered, the shadows stretched, and then, she was there. The witch, grinning. "You didn't think this success was free, did you?" the old woman cooed. Stepping forward, Zaya's blood turned to ice. "I gave you what you wanted," she whispered. "I did as you asked." The witch's grin widened. "Yes, and now, it's time to pay your price." Zaya swallowed hard. "What do you want?" The witch's eyes gleamed. "Your womb." Zaya staggered back. "What?" The old woman stepped closer, her bony fingers brushing against Zaya's stomach. "To keep your success, you must offer your future. You will never bear a child, never have a legacy beyond your food." Zaya's chest tightened. She thought of her mother, of everything Malia had sacrificed. "No," she whispered, "I won't do it." The witch's smile faded. "You think you can refuse me?" she hissed. "You think you can break a bargain?" The wind howled through the house, rattling the windows, knocking over the gold coins Zaya had counted just moments before. "If you do not pay your price," the witch whispered, "then everything will be taken from you." And in an instant, she was gone. But Zaya knew she had made an enemy. The next morning, something changed. When Zaya opened her stall, the villagers came as usual, eager, hungry. But the moment the first bowl touched their lips, they collapsed. One by one, they dropped to the ground, choking, convulsing, just like the nobleman had. Years ago, a familiar horrified silence fell over the market. Then, the whispers began. "She poisoned them. She's a witch." Zaya's heart pounded. "No, I didn't." But she saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear they once had for her mother. And she knew. The witch had cursed her. The people of Ember turned against her. The very same hands that once reached for her food now reached for stones. Zaya ran. She fled through the marketplace, into the trees, into the night, her mother's screams echoing in her mind. She ran until she could run no more. And when she collapsed beneath the towering trees of the hollow forest, the witch's laughter followed her into the darkness. No one ever saw Zaya in Ember Village again. Some say she died in the hollow forest, cursed to wander forever. Others say she became one of the witches herself, whispering secrets to desperate souls who came seeking power. But on cold nights, when the wind howls through Ember's streets, people say the scent of Zaya's cursed food still lingers in the air. A reminder of the price she paid. A warning to those who would seek power without knowing the cost.